I am the National Youth Engagement Lead of the Australian Youth Affairs Coalition. And I would like to begin tonight with an acknowledgement of country. So I'd like to begin by acknowledging the traditional owners and custodians of the land on which we're all meeting today. And I would like to extend my respect to elders past and present, as well as to emerging leaders. And I extend that respect to any First Nations person here today on the call with us. So before I pass over to Katie, I'm just going to run you through some housekeeping. It's going to be stuff that you're all going to be super familiar with. So just so that everyone is aware, we will be recording today. So if you want to blank out your screens, please feel free to do so. There'll also be someone monitoring the chat. So if you want to reach out there and engage that way, please do so. And we have captions enabled. So if you'd like to turn on the captions, I know that my Northern Irish accent can be a bit difficult at times. So I promise, that's absolutely fine if you decide to do that. So without further ado, I would like to introduce Katie. So Katie Atkinson is a long-time youth advocate and youth worker, and she's over 2 decades experience of driving change alongside young people. And just over a year ago, Katie embarked upon a Churchill Fellowship, and she's been working with us here at the Australian Youth Affairs Coalition to bring back some insights from that piece of research so that we can try and apply them in our practice here. So across that Churchill Fellowship, Katie went to France, Portugal, England, Ireland, Canada, and she's brought back all of those lessons for us to think about within our practice here. And this is actually our fifth installment of the Spotlight series with Katie. And if this event is anything that like the last, there will definitely be an insightful, interesting conversation. So I suppose all that remains for me to do is just to pass over to Katie and let her just lead us into that night with a little bit more detail. So over to you, Katie.
Thanks so much, Dr. Dean. I am so grateful to join you all. I feel a little bit emotional, actually. This is the fifth one. I'm also always emotional because I'm on the lands that I'm on. I'm on the Wonnegal Clans lands in the Eora Nation, and I just want to pay my respects to elders past, present, and emerging, and those of you First Nations leaders in the room. Your knowledge and wisdom directs us all and is the future for our country, and I would say the world, but that's just me. I am really just honoured to be here today to do my very last spotlight. Before I begin, can I just check that you can see? Yes, we're good. Okay. Technology and me sometimes has a problem. Some of you might know me, some of you don't. Some of you might know my wonderful guest, who I'll introduce a bit later, or you might know AAC really well. But why I'm here today is I was really honoured to be awarded a Churchill a fellowship 2 years ago, and I was able to travel to a number of different countries because I was really interested in finding out how to basically do work better in Australia. So I have been a youth advocate, as Dean said, for almost 30 years, and I have really had an incredible opportunity to work with many young people and communities in Australia to see some really exceptional work. And yet at the same time, some of the best things that we saw, and there are some examples of, the top one is one of my favorite ones, when we thought we were going to get the voting age reduced to 16 in Australia. That was go AAC. Oh, it didn't quite happen, didn't get passed through Parliament. Okay, fine. Then there are some other examples of some advocacy that happened where there was some really exciting recognition of what young people were bringing, their expertise, issues that they were facing, and yet it just didn't stick, and I just couldn't work out why. So I wanted to go overseas and find out how other people were involving young people in decision making. If there was something that I could bring back to Australia, I thought I could bring back this perfect cake. Like, here's a project, here's how you do it perfectly. And so I went and had, talked to a lot of people. I think I did 33 interviews in the end over 4.5 weeks. And what I found was there is no perfect way. There's no perfect mix. But I did learn so much from from a number of people. And I wanted to start with some of the things from my report, some quotes from young people that sort of sit with me. And for those of you who work with young people on a regular basis, these will not be unusual quotes, but young people talked about tokenism, being brought into rooms where decisions were being made and the decision was already made, but they were just there essentially as decoration. Let's just take a picture with you. Young people really felt like that they were burnt out. They were being asked to carry a load and they didn't have a lot of supports. There was just a lot of experiences where it didn't work very well. And then there were lots of experiences of what worked really, really well. In my previous spotlights, I've kind of gone through specifics, but because this is the last, I thought, why not just get you to the end of the report and give you my real takeaways and the things that I kind of really talk about the most. And what's really important, what I found was, and we'll talk a little bit more with my wonderful guest, but where you start matters. And that was really surprising to me. Like, I thought that you could just bring young people into the room, and as long as there was a decision to be made and you had some things, it would just kind of happen. And what I found was actually it's really important to be really honest about what you're trying to achieve, where you start. It really does matter as to the success of what happens at the end. I found that, as I said, there's no perfect model. There's just some really significant key ingredients that really make a difference. That lived experience alone is not enough. And this is a little bit controversial, but take for a young person, for example, just because you have young people in a room, just because there are a number of young people who care about an issue, it does not mean that you will create systems change or genuine inclusion. Just because they exist doesn't mean it will happen. You have to actually work for it. And there are some things that you really need to make sure it happens. I feel really passionate about this one, is that we have to learn from our failures and not avoid them. I think sometimes, I know for myself, I have got to the end of something and it didn't turn out the way I thought it would be. And it was like I was supposed to be making a beautiful, perfect sponge cake, and instead it was a flat pancake. And I pretended like, oh, we intended it to be a pancake the whole time. And that wasn't the case. And I think because of that, we lost the opportunity to really share the learnings, to learn from young people, to be transparent, and it breaks trust when we lie. And I think talking about failures is super, super important. These two things are just at the end. I think I was surprised at Australia is actually really ahead in many ways, but in structural reform and inclusion, particularly of young people and lived experience, we're behind many other countries in the world. And there's a lot of simple things that we can do. We have the key ingredients. We really just need to think about how we put them in place better. And on a personal note, I was surprised to hear just how often our thinking about the crisis point as a funding model being successful, you just don't get the outcomes that you want unless you pull that funding earlier on. And there's a lot of conversations across the world about this, and I thought it was just an Australian conversation, but really it is just something that young people and the projects that I talk to working with young people and mental health all talked about this. So it's worth kind of noting there. But one of the things, my first point was where you start matters, and I thought I'd just touch on it briefly because we're going to talk a little bit about some key ingredients that I saw, and probably one of the best examples I've ever seen a little bit later. But what I found is that often in youth projects and youth advocacy, specifically for me, I was trying to put everything in the bowl and mix it all together. And actually what I found across the world was when people were really clear about where they were starting and what they were trying to achieve, then the building blocks that came from that and all the ingredients that went in the bowl then produced really successful outcomes. And so these were just some of the things that I talk about in my report that were some of the really clear examples of where people had clear objectives about what they were trying to achieve when they were including young people and lived experience. And we'll speak a little bit today with Dr. Kate Martin from Wellcome Trust about expertise-based inclusion. But this was a real challenge for me, that I often try to do way too much, and I'm surprised that I don't get the results that I want. And it's because I wasn't clear about where I was starting, and I definitely tried to put too many things in place. What I'd love to talk about is, finishing up. It was a difficult one to think about, like, how do we want to finish? And I thought, there's a couple of conversations from my Churchill that have really stuck with me. And the conversation with Kate plays in my head at least once a week. And it's been a year and a half, I think, since we first saw Kate. But just the concept of what it would take to really embed lived experience in a really large organization, I think really shocked me at how possible it is, and how often I just found that I underestimated big bureaucracies or big organizational structures, that they're too big, that they couldn't possibly include young people or lived experience or anything that's not just part of that structure. And what Kate and her team took me through was a tangible, real example of how that works and what that looks like. And these were some of the key ingredients that I saw and pulled out from our conversation. And we'll talk a little bit more about it as we chat. But I definitely saw this in the Wellcome Trust, and I think where I saw other mechanisms around the world that were similarly successful, there were some key ingredients, and these were some of the ones that I saw. So the formal governance embedding, it wasn't just an add-on, it was structural. Genuine power over resources, that was a fascinating one. There's so many places where they gave groups power to decide where money went, which I don't know about all of you, but I had just never seen anything quite like that before. And it might not even just be funding money. It might be like resources of time, allocation, an organization's approach, resources of humans or attention, was really interesting. Investment before participation, and that really was around training and mentoring, supporting, is making sure that there was structures in place. There was an investment in the structures to make sure that the participation of young people or lived experience was very clearly formalized. It had a place, it had a structure, it had supports. Paid professional roles. This is a little controversial. Sometimes, depending on where you start, this is really important. But if you are paying people for their expertise and their profession, and it's an expertise-based space, then the young people or people with lived experience are bringing a skill set that is similar and should be respected and paid accordingly. And that is really important. There are some caveats for different areas where that is different, but I think specifically on expertise-based, it's so important. Accountability mechanisms goes without saying. How do you measure what you say you're doing? Is it true? Is it honest? Intersectional recruitment, really key and important. You're going to get a homogenous group if you recruit in a homogenous way. So, yeah, if you're not getting the people who you think you want or need in your group, you might want to look at your recruitment processes. And institutional policy backing, really important. I think it made such a huge difference where there was legislative space for inclusion, where it was legislated, where there was committees that couldn't be moved with a political party's will, or where there was a change of a CEO or a project lead and it was part of the policy and not just a good intention of a human. That really seemed to make a huge difference. And this bottom one, I think, protection from harm, and maybe we'll talk about it a bit later, but I think we should be at the very minimum aiming that our processes that we're trying to do not harm the people who are in them, like as a baseline. But it's funny that we have to say that, and actually, we really need to think about what that looks like sometimes. Are we creating harm for people who are involved? And specifically when we're talking about lived experience and mental health, it's a really important conversation to be had, that we'll do. So that feels like enough for me. I want to just take a moment to, really honor Dr. Kate Martin, who I met at the Wellcome Trust. When I was doing my Churchill, I was looking for people who were doing innovative work, and there was one person's name who came up from a lot of people when I said, "Do you know anybody who's doing great work?" And they were like, "Oh, yep, you should talk to Kate." So I was pleasantly surprised when Kate got back to me and said, "Yes, gotta love LinkedIn. Thank you so much, Kate, for checking that." But also just so impressed by the dedication and work that Kate shows in the work that you do, but also just that your willingness to share it openly with other people so that we can replicate what you do. So without further ado, I will stop sharing my screen and introduce to you Dr. Kate Martin from the Wellcome Trust. Welcome, Kate. Maybe you could
Thank
tell
you.
us a little bit about the Wellcome Trust and how you came to work there.
Sure. So first of all, hi Casey. Hi everybody. Thanks so much for having me. Well, for you this evening, for me this morning. So bear with me. I'm only one coffee in. So the Wellcome Trust, we are a global charitable foundation, and we believe in sort of science's ability to improve health and save lives. And I particularly work on Wellcome's mental health program. Which is aiming to make a step change in early intervention for people living with anxiety, depression, psychosis. So we worked to fund research, to influence policy, to really essentially develop new and improved interventions to help people living with anxiety, depression, and psychosis to get help as early as they can, and really to make sure that those sort of interventions reach people. Gosh, how did I get here? In a nutshell, so I suppose my background. So I have lived experience of mental health challenges myself. I'm a carer for family members living with complex mental health challenges, but I've kind of worked all over the system in the UK in sort of voluntary sector, statutory sector, from small local charities to national organisations, working with young people living with mental health challenges, disabled young adults, people with learning difficulties, in youth justice, social care, basically across all sectors. And the kind of the key thread for me has always been a frustration about how can we do better, or that we're not doing enough, essentially, to really give young people or people who people with lived experience enough autonomy in their lives, and how can we really put people at the forefront of decision making, and whether that's decision making in their own lives, in services, in research, in policy. So I've always been trying to grapple with that, similar to you're doing with this report, always trying to try what are those ingredients that really make that work and really give that kind of change and that kind of power and autonomy to people.
And had you always brought your personal lived experience into the workplace? Is this a new thing? Because that, for me, I was really excited by the fact that you just spoke so openly, and so many people in England were speaking so openly about their lived experience and how that made them, that's part of why they were in the role they were, and the expertise that they brought to that job.
I think that's definitely evolved. So I suppose there's two answers to that question. I suppose, yes, I always have. How openly I've done that, I think, has changed massively over the years. So I think that's always been a driving force. Like from being I was a young carer in my teens, although I didn't quite realize I was a young carer until I was too old to be one. But I suppose that's a state for most young carers. But it was always the driving force of what I did. I saw the sort of the lackings of the care systems, I suppose, for my family members, and always wanted to sort of drive and improve that. And so that frustration, that sort of desire to change things has always really been the kind of push for what I've done. How openly I've been about my own lived experience has definitely evolved over the years, and I think it's evolved more so probably the older I've got, but also the more over the years, I suppose, the more that lived experience has been recognised and valued as a kind of form of knowledge, as a form of expertise or insight. That's the more, I suppose, able I felt to be open about that as one form of expertise that I bring. I think this carries so much, still does in many places, and in many ways carry a lot of stigma that I think people think you're either someone with lived experience or you're a professional. And I think it's still that kind of dual identity is still sort of misunderstood, I think. So yes, I am now. I think things have shifted massively, but probably only the last 5, 10 years have I felt that things have really sort of shifted to enable people to be more open about their lived expertise.
Yeah, I might actually just because I realize I always get so honed in on the conversation with the people in the chat. I'm curious as to whether lived experience is something that would be valued as part of your professional work in your organizations. Just as Dean, I didn't give you these questions, just, but I'd love to hear in the chat whether it's something that you currently speak about in your workplaces, because as you said, Kate, yeah, I have seen in the last number of years is that maybe that the amount of education that's happening, the stigma reduction work has meant that people were able to speak more openly, but also see it as a form of knowledge and understanding that is really valuable to their work, their decisions, what they bring to every space that they're in. But I do feel like it's new. And so that's why, sorry, I just thought I'd take the opportunity
Yeah,
because I think your role as a senior leader is really exceptional in that space.
yeah. And I suppose the other thing that we do, what I've done in previous roles, but also in this one is to have a real kind of clear framing about what we mean by lived experience and what that means in terms of what people are bringing to the role or the organization. But I think also really importantly, what we're not asking people to bring. So we've had a really kind of ongoing actually conversation with our team of we have a global team of lived experience advisors and consultants in this program who are based in so I've got to draw the map in my head now, the UK, South Africa, Rwanda, Kenya, India, Indonesia and Australia. So that's our current team of consultants. We have 17 advisors and consultants working with us. And we've had to sort of a really strong conversation both at the beginning, but also we keep sort of refreshing that about what does that mean for people in their roles. I think so often people with lived experience are asked to come along, tell their personal stories, share deep personal experiences, and that's the kind of limit. And so we've had sort of really work together to think through what that means for us. And in the nicest possible way, we kind of say to each other, we're completely disinterested in each other's personal experiences. They're ours, they're our own. What we bring is knowledge, insight, expertise, questions, ideas, opinions that form and shape the work we do. You know, a psychologist or a researcher don't come along and talk about their personal experiences as being a researcher. They bring their perspective about the issue at hand, the decision at hand, the problem we're trying to solve. Similarly around lived experience is that we're not saying people should never share their personal experience for sure, but what we're saying is that's someone's choice, and that everything they say, everything they do, everything I say or do is informed by that lived experience, knowledge and perspective. But I don't have to share personal details, personal experiences to sort of to into that role. And I certainly think a lot of our lived experience consultants sort of have said, what a shift that's been. Certainly it was a shift for me. What a shift that's been to be valued for what you bring, not the story you tell. Which can be re-traumatizing to only ever be asked to sort of talk about difficult experiences, personal stories. I think it can be quite limiting, and it can also be quite sort of re-traumatizing, I suppose. We've really tried to say shift it into you bring knowledge, ideas, views, opinions, and that's what we expect. Yeah, that's the roles that we have here, and certainly that's what helped me as well, sort of bring that into my work, my perspectives.
You're right, and we don't sit there and ask, a professor in neurology to like talk about their own experience at home or their personal life, and yet at the same time, if there's a lived experience like role, or if there's a panel, or if there's an advisory body, it is almost expected that we say or like retell your story every time, rather than thinking about what is it that you bring to this and what is the knowledge and how do we respect that space, which we would do in other situations. Oh, that's really powerful. You have touched on it, but I'd love you to talk about what exactly that process is, or the panel that you have is, and how it works within the Wellcome Trust.
Sure. So first we have 17 advisors and consultants now, but that they've grown from the start of the program. The mental health program has been going about 6 years. So we started off with about 5 consultants. That's grown now to 17 as the program's kind of grown in size and scope. I suppose there's a kind of few things that jump to mind about how we set that up. So first of all, as I said, was our sort of thinking around what the role is. So it's about expertise. And so when we were recruiting for these roles, lived experience is the starting point, not the end point. And often I find in other organizations, this is from my own, work in the past as well, often it's people you see lived experience as the end point. Do you have lived experience of this issue? That's almost like the end of the recruitment, whereas we sort of flip that round and go, lived experience is the starting point, but what other knowledge, skills, experience do we need people to have? And I suppose we're careful on experience to say people don't have to have necessarily had experience of doing something. We realise that there's lots of people who don't have the opportunity. But for example, we would say we need people with the kind of either experience or the ability or interest in mental health research, or so that ability to engage and bring other forms of expertise as well as their kind of lived experience to this program. Secondly, we really wanted to make sure that we didn't just have a separate advisory group. That's nothing wrong with advisory groups, by the way, but they're one kind of method for collaborating with people. They're not the only one, but I think that's often the default that people fall to is, well, let's just get an advisory group set up. And people think, I think, well, is that really the best way? Like, what does the program need? How do we need to work together? And so the way that our team is structured is so in the mental health program, we have sort of about 6 different teams working on different aspects of the program. I and our lived experience advisors, rather than being a separate advisory group, are embedded in each of those teams. We have sub-teams of lived experience consultants and advisors that work with each of those teams on a day-to-day basis. So whether that's from team meetings, brainstorming sessions, planning funding calls, reviewing funding applications, making funding decisions, basically whatever we do, they do it with us. And that's important, I think, for a few reasons. One is, like most organizations are complex. And unless you're kind of involved in all that day-to-day thinking, if you're only just brought in every now and then, it's not to say people can't contribute, but I think it really limits how people can contribute, because I think it particularly limits how people can challenge. If you don't know the day-to-day detail, depth, how can you challenge? How do you see when things perhaps aren't going the way that they're supposed to? Or how do you challenge decisions that are being made if you're kind of not party to most of the information? So what was really key to us was making sure those colleagues are embedded in our team, not as a kind of a separate separate group that we meet sort of once a month. So they then work with us. So we have lived experience consultants. They are roles that are guaranteed for sort of 2 or 3 days a week. They kind of help lead shape programs. They help lead the planning of the lived experience involvement with us, etc. Lived experience advisors, it's a very similar role, a bit more ad hoc, but most of them work several days a month with us. But they'll work on particular projects, have particular input. So I suppose to make it really embedded, those they were the 2 things: A, thinking about their roles as expertise, and B, making sure that they were working with us in a way that actually enabled them to have influence, enabled us to work really closely together. So they were part of the team, not a sort of a separate add-on, I suppose.
And was it always like that? Like when you joined Wellcome Trust, was that the structure that always existed? Had it always had a lived experience advisory like roles, or?
No, so we were, I suppose this is one of the luckiest things for us, I suppose, is that the mental health program only started 6 years ago, and we started 6 years ago too. So we were involved pretty much from within the first few months of the program getting going. And I think that has made it so much easier, because we basically built the program. So there was myself and then sort of 5 or 6 lived experience consultants and advisors that were at the beginning of the program. We were a team then, maybe an employed team of maybe 8 people, where now there's probably 40 odd, 45 people working on the mental health program overall, plus our 17 advisors and consultants. What that's meant is we started with lived experience. We built the program sort of incrementally, and the sort of expanded lived experience involvement as we've gone. And it's meant that everybody who's joined the program has joined an organization and joined a program that lived experience is valued, lived experience is already built in. Yes, it's always changing and evolving, sure, but it was, I suppose the reason why that was so helpful is as most people in this call will, I'm sure, have the same experience of, often when you do youth or lived experience involvement, you are coming into something that already exists.
Yeah.
And so whilst, of course, Wellcome's been around forever, the mental health program was really new, so we could build it differently. And it's much easier to build something from the start than it is to come into an organization and try and change the way people have always done things. That's really difficult. It takes, and I think if I'd have joined the mental health program, if I hadn't joined from the start, we wouldn't be anywhere near as far ahead as, we wouldn't have done half of what we've managed to do by now because, as I say, it's so hard to undo and change practice. That's much more challenging.
What would you say sort of were the key building blocks as you were kind of designing it and you were building it together? What were the kind of key things that you were like, we have to have these things? I would say ingredients, but maybe
Yeah.
for you when you're building something, maybe building blocks for
Yeah.
you.
Yeah. What were the key ingredients? So, I mean, this was more, it's easy to say having people there from the start. I know that isn't always feasible, if possible, to get people there right from the beginning, or at least when you're bringing it in to an existing organization, almost to have a bit of a fresh start, to realize that things have to be undone as well as sort of built up, I suppose.
Mm.
But I have to say, in 25 years, this is the first time I've ever joined a program right from the start. So most of the time, I have done the other thing of coming into existing organizations and try and sort of reframe things. So that was definitely one, but I guess a lucky one in some ways. I suppose some of the other building blocks were to just get going. So I think we can spend so long thinking about what to
Mm.
do, how to do it in the best possible way, that we don't end up really doing anything. And that's not to say we shouldn't be thoughtful about doing things well, but I don't know if I've ever done any kind of involvement and it's gone to plan. Because I just don't think that's involvement then. So for example, I've worked in this space for years. Have I, before I joined Wellcome, I'd never involved people in co-designing multi-million pound grant research funding programs. I had some basic principles I could carry with me, but it was new for all of us. So we had to, I suppose one of the biggest building blocks for us was having a learning while we're doing approach. So we've got the research team, funding team, lived experience advisors to all come together and say, look, we're planning this funding call. We're going to be reviewing these funding applications. We've got a funding decision committee. What do we think the best way to do this will be? And let's just make our best guess. But I suppose the most important bit of that was saying, even if we make our best guess, some of it's going to go really well, some of it will be a disaster. But we all went into it knowing that. So it wasn't this. I think often we try and be perfect for people with lived experience or perfect for young people. And there's no such thing. And I think then we let people down when it's not, doesn't turn out that way. So we sort of all went in it together going, some of it will work really well, some of it won't. Let's just give it our best shot. And we were kind of in it together. And we kind of regularly paused and reviewed what's going well, what are the challenges, how do we make this better, what do we refine for next time, and then we'd set an action to make it better to refine a way of doing something for next time, and that wouldn't work, but we kept trying, and I think that was probably the biggest success ingredient. I think was knowing we're all in it together, making our best guess, acknowledging it's not all going to work perfectly, and that kind of iterative way of working really built trust, because there was no pretense, there was no defensiveness when things didn't work. Everyone just went, oh God, we did not think that was going to be so difficult. What do we do next time? And I suppose having that approach was what kind of made us get sort of develop trust and to make the changes we need to. And I suppose the other big win is having a senior role. So I'm a member of the mental health program leadership team, and I think so often lived experience or youth involvement roles are often quite junior, and that's not in any kind of derogatory way, but there is a range of roles. I suppose the importance of having a senior role on the senior leadership team is I'm not always having to push other people to make the changes. I'm part of the senior decision making to make sure that lived experience and youth involvement is embedded in our strategic thinking and decision making. And I think that's really, really critical, because I think most of the work we do in these roles weirdly isn't about lived experience or youth involvement. It's about organizational change, process change, organizational policy change, people change, practice change. As we're kind of really trying to unpick and change the way organizations function, and that's, if you're not in a role that enables that to happen, or there isn't a role that enables that to happen, it's really difficult. And I think people have great ideas, but perhaps not always the level of influence needed to put those things into practice.
I definitely found that talking with you, and then I saw it again at the Council on Youth at the European Council, that they very much had these incredible bureaucrats or structural insiders that were in leadership and knew how to make the mechanisms work. And I think that senior leadership, or the very skilled organizational movers and changers, was so pivotal for those big organizational move pieces where young people or lived experience was included. There were roles like yours and very skilled people like you within the organizations to allow the work to happen inside, because it just takes so much work within a big structure to create space to learn, to grow, to move.
Yeah, and I suppose actually if I look around, I mean, I can't by any means take even most of the credit for the work we've done at Wellcome, because I mean, I think if I, you know, our research funding teams who handle all our research funding processes have been phenomenal. They've really understood what we're trying to do and have really helped us sort of change our funding practices and approaches to enable this to happen. Or another huge support for us, and we would say we wouldn't have done it without these colleagues, is our program management team, who manage all of our decision-making processes, our organizational policies, our team decision-making processes, all those kind of things, who've said, right, how do we really make sure we're changing the processes to support this to happen? So I suppose the other big ingredient for us was, I suppose it's two things, I suppose, but one is about our kind of team culture is that, our lived experience team culture is that we should almost try to do ourselves out of a job, that we want to build it in a way that most of us could walk away and it would still happen, because it's not resting on us anymore. This is now just the way that Wellcome's mental health program operates. And so what that meant was we've really had to bring in our program management team, research funding colleagues, all the people who work in the mental health program, and we've now got changes in our decision-making processes. So, for example, a project can't get past a certain point in a decision-making process unless there's a sort of a lived experience advisor named working on the project, or certain kind of work of lived experience involvement and collaboration has been done, or, you know, all of our funding applications get reviewed and our funding decisions are made with our lived experience colleagues. So there's so much behind the scenes stuff that needs to make that happen, and it's often slow, and it's you know, it's sort of detailed, in a way, kind of mundane behind the scenes stuff, but I often think is the most powerful, because all of our colleagues in program management, research funding, etc., have now changed the way those processes work, and it's pretty hard to undo those. So it's often the stuff you don't see. I think it's all that behind the scenes stuff, I think, is often the most powerful, but often gets less credit, I suppose.
To put it into perspective, because I'm so sorry I'm not across Wellcome Trust's scope, it is quite a large trust. Am I correct? Like, what are the kind of public figures that we have out there as far as the scope of the work that the trust does across the world?
So we are an organisation, I think, of about 1,300 people. We give out about, I think, 1.5 and 1.8 billion pounds per year.
Pounds, billion pounds. Okay, yeah, good. Yeah.
So we're a big one of the biggest global charitable foundations. The mental health program is part of that. So we have four major funding programs, really. We have mental health, we have climate and health, we have infectious disease. There are kind of sort of solutions programs. We're trying to make a difference against kind of some of the biggest human health challenges. Then we have a massive sort of discovery research program, which is sort of much broader based. It's our biggest funding area, but sort of discovery into sort of any advances of sort of human health and well-being. So lots of sort of basic sciences, humanities and social sciences, etc. So it's a really large organisation. And so we're sort of embedded within one of the four major programs.
The reason I asked you to just like be so specific is because I think what I found is the doors closing would often be like, that would be a nice idea, but that would probably work for something really small, you know, like, oh, maybe if, you know, but we deal in hundreds of thousands, Katie, like you can't. and so the fact that the Wellcome Trust, with billions of pounds every year and such a huge scope of work and such a long history, could not only figure out but allow the lived experience decision making to happen so organically and yet systemically, is really shocking, to be honest. Like, I was shocked that how it actually works, because I had thought it probably wouldn't in an organization or a trust your size. Like it's just mind blowing to think about what we could possibly do. If you can do it, then like our smaller state governments and our local governments, our smaller organizations, like it's all possible within the structures that we have. Knowing that structures are complicated and they can move, they just move slowly, like you said.
Yeah, and so I've done this work as like I'm sure many people on this call have in all sorts of different. So on the flip side of that, often a challenge we get quite rightly is yeah, but it's easy for the Wellcome Trust because you've got a load of money, right? You can afford to
Right.
do this. So I think you're absolutely right. There's this. Yes. I think people are sometimes surprised because of the scale of the organisation, the scale of the mental health program that we've managed to embed lived experience in the way we have. On the flip side, people often challenge us and say, well, yeah, but it's easy because you've got funding and resource to do it. And of course, that's, I can't deny the privilege we have working in this space and being able to sort of resource lived experience work in the way that we can. But before here, for example, I worked independently. I worked for myself for a number of years, sort of 8 years, and modeled the same practice. I've worked in, under-resourced national charities in the UK with very limited budget, and we've sort of managed to embed lived experience involvement. And I'm not trying to deny the importance of money and resource, but I think for me, the biggest challenge I've seen in the organisations I've worked with and with others isn't just about resource. Actually, it's about that willingness for those organisations to change. And the biggest frustration I've had over the years is whether the people above me, the people who've had the decision-making influence, will hear me about the change we need to make in the organisation. Will they help me change the policies, the practices, or do they just want it to be tokenistic? Do they just want it to look nice on the outside? And like you were saying before, right? So many organisations want to say, yeah, oh my God, we involve young people in everything we do. And what they mean is every photo opportunity.
Yeah.
What they don't mean is decisions where the real power sits on, where budgets are spent or on the kind of really influential stuff. And I've sort of, like many people in school, have battled that for years. So of course, money's part of it, but I think it's also about the approach taken and the willingness, I suppose, of the organisations to make that change.
Now, like, because you've been doing it for so long, not every decision maker, especially when we talk about power, it's a complicated conversation, and it's not an easy one. I was very surprised when my Churchill was successful because I was talking about power sharing, and I was like, how is this something that's going to be funded? But power is not something we often want to give up if you have it. There's groups of people who have a lot more of it. It can be complicated to try to convince people to share it and the value to that. Do you have any good failure lessons or success lessons for us about, how you do get people to consider power sharing and thinking about involving more people?
Yeah, since it's a really interesting one, that it's a great question. I think you hit it on the head. When people talk about power sharing, I think they feel like they've got to give something up. Like, so I think some people experience power sharing as some kind of loss. And I think, but more commonly, I think people, I don't know, it's not that they don't want to do it, it's they just don't see how in their specific circumstance it will work, right? So whether that's because it's, it's a complex organization, it's kind of government policy or whatever, and they start, it's so complicated. I think people just think, well, I find this complicated. How on earth am I going to bring in other people to this? Like this is, or, like for example, at Wellcome, we fund a whole breadth of research, right? Right from basic early stage animal model or neuroscience research through to peer-led interventions and implementing them. So you can see the vast range of kind of complexity of those kinds of research. And at one end, I don't think even people call it lived experience. This is just the way research is done. Of course, you bring people into it because people have just learned to understand the value it brings, and I suppose it's easier to think in in an intervention or a peer-led piece of research, the opportunities for people to really be involved. In early stage research or in complex decisions, I don't think anymore that people are necessarily anti it. I just don't think they see what that power sharing means. Like what we often get, So I think it's up to us to try and show what influence people can have, and that it's not necessarily giving up power. It's more about how, I don't know, in my mind, I often visualize it as like a Trivial Pursuit pie, right? That you've got all these, there's no one form of expertise needed for most of the decisions, complex decisions at a government or a scientific level. you need multiple perspectives around the table, and we're just adding in that missing piece of lived experience or youth knowledge into that. That it's not about, and I suppose within that people do have to give something up, but when you frame it as an addition, just a missing perspective, like and you start, then people start to realize what values those perspectives bring, because often we'll get scientists going, actually, do you know what, my retention rates in my clinical trial are now so much better now we've been collaborating with young people. They're not experiencing that as a loss anymore. They're not seeing that as a loss. They're seeing that as, wow, that is bringing something we didn't know, or we hadn't seen, we hadn't realized what difference this could make. And once they found that, they're almost like they get hooked, right? Because once they see, wow, okay, now I see the difference this can make, then they'll do it again, and they'll do it more and more and more. So I don't know, I think power sharing is tricky, particularly in America, these kind of complex decisions where there's no one real kind of decision making, that power is actually quite diffuse. That actually we can start to bring in lived experience, youth perspectives, and show the kind of benefit that brings. And I think almost all of a sudden then it becomes, people are like, duh, well, of course we need this. How have we done without this for so long? It just becomes, I don't know, a normalized, I suppose.
Well, on that, I might just pause for a second just to say with the people who are in the chat, if you have questions specifically for Kate, because this is such an opportunity and I could just talk to Kate forever, please put them in. I'll have a couple more questions for Kate, but I would love to create a space, if you're open to it, Kate, to answer a couple of questions. But while we're talking about that power sharing, so that's a good, I think that additive is a great, like, I love the trivial pursuit pie, that's fantastic. How does that move from being a add-on, like an addition, oh, I can see it as a value, to being then embedded? So what you've done as far as embedding it in decision making with policy changes and positions in programs and project timelines, everything is including in really different ways. What do you think is the space between that starting point of getting people to care or think of it as an add-on or an addition, and a positive addition, to actually embedding it through processes and systems?
I just think they've got to do it. So you've got to learn by doing. And I don't know. I think as a lived experience or youth community, we've been telling people the value of this for years. So I think people know it in some ways. They're kind of like, oh yeah, well, I kind of get it. I think people don't get how to do it. What's the value here now? Or people can see the value for, over there. But like, there was like a special case, oh, but it's too complex in my organization, or it's too complex in my area. And I just think we can keep telling people, but until people start working together, they won't see it in the same way. And I think the biggest success I've had over the years is almost to stop trying to tell people why they should do it and what the benefit of it is, and just start doing it. And when people start doing it, then they see the inherent value, because they hear something they hadn't thought of, or they see a change in a project the way they hadn't realized, or they see they realize kind of the depth of knowledge that people with lived experience have, or and all of a sudden, once you've shown them, once they've kind of been involved in it, and you've kind of held their hand a bit in terms of getting it going, and I say you can see that light bulb go on. They go, oh my God, next time we could do this, and we could do this, and we could do this, and it just builds from there. And so I'd say as a starting point, just getting people to work together on something tangible, just getting people working together on something tangible will then lead to people going, do you know what, we'll make it easier next time. If only we could change this policy for next time. If only we could do, and all of a sudden it kind of takes on a bit of a life of its own. But if we, so I think also start small, because I think if we try and change everything all at once, it's too much, it's too overwhelming for people, it's too diffuse. And so I think to start small and build from there, I think has sort of always been the trick, I think.
So you're not really talking about advocating then for change, it's just about demonstrating possibilities for changing, letting the system realize that change could be embedded and it would keep the positive things happening almost.
I think there is a space for advocacy, but I suppose, like, I don't know, I've always tried to think about it as like who's inside and who's outside of an organization. So there's definite space for, like, strong vocal advocacy, youth lived experience advocacy organizations calling for change and holding like the gold standard of what we're all trying to aim for. But the gold standard is really critical, But where we are in organisations is normally poles apart, right? We're normally not even on the screen, we're over here normally. So yes, you need advocacy and strong voices, strong advocates to really hold, this is the goal, so this is where we're aiming to, and this is where we have to get. But then when you're inside an organisation, you can't just leapfrog to that. If we could, we would have been there decades ago. So I
Yeah.
suppose the way I find it is, if this is where we're aiming for, how do I help this organisation make, in collaboration with people with lived experience, with young people, how do you make the next step and the next step and the next step? And before you realise it, if you break it down to small steps, you get way closer to that than you realise. So I suppose you need both, is what I would say.
Well, I think it's unusual for me, possibly working very closely with young people across many different services and projects and across a number of decades, and then being an advocate and a national advocate, like reflecting what people are saying and making sure that young people have microphones and voices and the cameras in front of them, and then they get to say things that they need to about what needs to change. The big gap in my understanding and knowledge is actually, if we need the system to change, how do we change that system? So we can yell at Parliament, for example, in Australia and say, hey, you should do this. And then maybe sometimes what they do is go, oh yeah, that's a great idea, let's do that. But it might just be tokenistic because it gets said, but then actually the change is quite complicated and big. And so that systems change. So for example, to change mental health in Australia, there's a lot of big systems involved in that in Australia. So the hospital system, the education system, there's very, very large bodies that are very slow moving and historic. And so we can see something, we can say something, but often seeing the systems change inside is really complicated. And I think for me as an advocate, I realized I'd failed to support the bureaucrats and the processes within those systems to really change from within, and acknowledging the time that it takes, because it feels so time pressured, particularly with young people, because they age out, the issues are really important. We can get I would get very like verbal and yelly, like we should do this. But I didn't get very practical with what it would look like for that system to change, and what do they need, and how do we support that internally, and thinking about being of service to those people within those structures was a really different approach.
But I think we need all those roles to make change. So we absolutely need those strong advocate voices who are holding government to account and say, or policymakers to account and saying this is the system change we need. But then I suppose you need like a whole spectrum of lived experience and youth involvement, right? Throughout the whole architecture, because you absolutely need those voices to call for change and to call out injustices and to get something on the public agenda, like 100%. But then it's like, well then once that's kind of moving in the right direction, how do you say support the bureaucrats when it changes, or within the hospital or research or education system? How does the change happen there? So I suppose it's never an either or, is it? It's always like a both and. Where are the people? And I think, again, those roles need to change. Then, like I've been an advocate. I've worked in some of the national youth mental health organisations here, doing like you're talking about, getting young people to really call out injustices and getting the government calling for change in government. That's really critical. But for example, I suppose you have to reframe the roles. Like if I'm then working within an organisation, like I don't need to do that kind of work here at Wellcome. I'm doing it because we're in a different position. Or when I've been, when I used to involve young people in research projects or in co-designing kind of national training programs, it was like, you have to sort of switch mindset. Like I'm not in the advocacy role now. Now I'm in the how do I make the change internally role. And they're just sort of different mindsets. So I suppose they're all important. It's just, I think sometimes as in lived experience and youth involvement and youth advocacy, we have to switch. Like, so which bit of the system are we in now? And how do I make the most effective change in this part of the system?
Yeah, and which part of the system, I think that pie thing that you're talking about is which part of the system are you in, and what are the opportunities for power there, and how do I be as honest as I can? And that was definitely something I saw everywhere I went, of the most successful projects, processes, organizations who were involving young people in lived experience they were really clear about what they were trying to achieve. So for example, in Wellcome Trust, you're not like we're the advocates. That's not what they're called. They're colleagues. They work in the system. They're part of the processes. And that was really unique because you were really clear about what you were trying to achieve, and you were the people who are involved in it are really clear about what they're trying to achieve. And I saw that in other projects as well, as when young researchers were, they knew that they were a researcher. They weren't there for sharing their personal experience. They were there for as a researcher, and they had a job description. It was really fascinating how much those boundaries really mattered. Is like, what is the context that we're working in? What is my job? What do I need to do? And the system respecting that, having space for that, was so empowering, particularly for young people. And I was confronted by my desire to empower and to make somebody feel special. And I was like, you can do anything and be anything that you want to be. And yet, actually, what they'd signed up for was to be a young researcher. Like, that's what they wanted to do and be. So me trying to make them into something else or make it bigger than that or different than that was actually really disrespectful, and disingenuous, really. I was like, that I was setting them up to fail, because it's not, that's not their job. Their job is very clear, and their role is really important, and we need to give them the space to do that role.
I think that like so much work we do in this space is like, I think it's only the last few years people have even really been talking about things like the clarity, the different kinds of roles that might exist in youth or lived experience involvement. Like, it just used to be like the one thing, like, really, and now the conversation's moved on, which is exciting. Like, about, well, actually, what does lived experience mean if you're a peer researcher or a lived experience consultant or a youth advocate? Like, I think that's really exciting. I don't think that's I suppose, like most of this world, we learn by our mistakes and what doesn't work out, and like that's when we realize the need for, do you know what, actually, yeah, in our desire to try and empower people and give people opportunity, maybe we've made things a little bit clear. No, now maybe we need to sort of focus on having more clarity on it. But I mean, what a nice place that we're in, that we can now have a multiple roles in organizations that have multiple different responsibilities and different expectations, because even a few years ago that didn't really exist. So it's exciting that we're getting there, I think.
Just on a selfish note, bit of a side tangent, but was there like an epic fail, or was there a moment where, like, something that you kind of harp back on that was like, that was a big learning for me, and I took that learning forward in a particular way? Because I don't know that we talk about those things enough, is that not everything goes to plan.
Yeah, well, most of it doesn't. I think is my reflection. I suppose, going back to what I was saying earlier about having that learning while doing approach, so having a really clear expectation that things will go wrong, things won't work, and that's normal and that's good, because we're figuring things out, right? There's no clear answer. We're working in complex systems. If everything worked so easily, then it wouldn't be a problem. We wouldn't be it. But I suppose one of the biggest epic fails I had was, this was right back years ago, was when I was first bringing in some disabled young consultants and young adults to work with us in a disability advocacy charity. And we'd focus so much on their inclusion, focus so much on what they would need to involve in decisions in the organisation and sit on the advisory group, that we'd kind of completely forgotten about what the staff and the employees might be feeling and worrying about and thinking, and had sort of really neglected them. So and so we'd only looked at kind of one side, and I think that was a real fail, because we had these really empowered young people who were really supported to come and be involved, but actually the rest of the team were a bit like, well, we don't know really how to engage with these young people or what their role is, or what best can we do to bring them into sort of decision making. So that was, I think that was a huge fail, but we learned from that and we rectified it. But I think that's where I started to really realize that you have to look at all elements of a system. What's the policies? Who are the people involved? Who are the lived experience youth advisors involved? Like, what does everything need to make that work?
Yeah, that's great. I just always like to take the opportunity to, like, celebrate failure. Like, as you said, it's like the learning is so helpful and valuable, but I think sometimes when you have a spotlight on you, we don't say that stuff. So it was, I think the learning that you shared, so important.
Yeah. And as I say, I think almost every project we do, we'll say we'll have these reflection points, and we'll sit there, and it's like, we'll have a bit of a laugh about it. We're like, oh my, it's always the things we think will go easy. We kind of reflect on it and go, my God, that was an absolute disaster. Like, we're not doing it like that again. What do we all do next time? Because it's not, I suppose, because it's just open, it's not like we're trying to pretend to our lived experience consultants everything's perfect. We're not worried about getting things perfect all the time. The lived experience advisors and consultants are in that with us, going, none of us know the perfect way to do this. Some of it will go well, some of it's going to be a disaster. And we just feel able to be open about it. There's no pretense. And I think that's been the biggest win. Still, and of course, it still stings sometimes when the thing you think that's going to go really well doesn't. I don't think we can underestimate that. You've planned it, you've done so much work. This is the bit you think is going to go really well, and that's the bit that's a disaster. And you're like, oh, but that is all part of the process, I think.
And not protecting people from that. Like, I think sometimes as a youth advocate, I would try to protect young people from the failures or from the system itself. And actually, it's part of the world that they live in, and it's their reality too. And so, like, it was, that respect of being honest, I think, is also really respectful as far as everyone's learning, not just your own.
Yeah.
Dean, is that your question? I think there's a question in the chat around transition, but Dean, if that's yours, do you want to ask it?
Yeah, I was posting in the wrong chat before. I thought I was making really great, and then nobody's engaging with these questions that I'm asking, but that's because I was sending it to Katie directly. So that would explain that. Yeah, so
Sorry,
like,
everyone.
sorry, apologies for depriving you of my
we
question.
share our failures. Dean, welcome,
Yeah,
welcome.
we share our
And
failures. I'm learning technology. Yeah, so one of the things that I was quite interested was you were talking there about, that there was that shift from you're not just having to turn up to share your experiences, which can be a little bit re-traumatizing if that's all that you're brought there for. But I was just wondering, like with policymakers, did it require a little bit of a change in thinking on their part? Because one of the things that I've sort of noticed is that while that focus on lived experience is great, it can also sometimes be like young people have to exchange those lived experiences for voice, and like it's their role to provide stories. And I was just wondering
yeah.
whether your organization had to work with those policymakers to bring about the change in how they are doing those consultations and setting those things up.
Yeah, that's interesting. I think there is a broader shift in this space to move away from sort of storytelling and sort of that kind of more extractive way of doing it. Like where we can, so certainly internally, I think that's really well understood in our mental health program. I think when we're working with external organisations, I suppose so we do have to try and think what's our role. We can't always tell people what to do or not do, but we when we're working with external organisations who are kind of working alongside us, we'll sort of say, oh, this is how we frame lived experience. We don't ask for storytelling for these reasons. This is how we frame lived experience as expertise. But I suppose the critical bit about that is that people will nod and go, oh yes, that's really great, but they don't know what questions to ask differently. So we'll say often. So what we did some work recently on with our sort of communications department on a various different sort of reports and external products and stuff like that. And the organisations were commissioned to do that work. We spent a lot of time with them thinking these are the questions you wouldn't, this is how you then frame questions. So you're not being extractive. You're not asking about personal experiences. You're asking about knowledge and expertise. So it wasn't just saying it. It was then showing people what does that mean in practice? Like what would and wouldn't you ask? And kind of almost like walking alongside them while they do that so that they can do it themselves next time. So I still think at big external events, people still want the kind of main speaker to be. I still think there's and I mean this in the mental health kind of sphere more broadly. I think people think like, we want to create change. To create change, you need emotional impact. To get emotional impact, you need someone to tell their story. And I think that's going to be a tough one to undo. And again, this is not to say personal stories are never relevant, or we should stop telling them. I just think we should question that a bit more about, is this really the best thing for this event, this moment? Is it the best thing for that person? Is there other ways to bring that change about? Are we just doing that because that's the default, or we're doing that intentionally? So, I don't want anybody to go off this call thinking we should never ask, but, people should never be, where Wellcome says people shouldn't talk about their personal experiences. We're not saying that at all. I suppose what I'm saying is when we use personal experiences, when people are asked to talk about, personal things, it should be done intentionally, not just by default. And that we should be thinking, giving people an out to contribute in a different way if that's what they prefer, I suppose. So it's a bit more, yeah, I suppose that's a sort of the extra bit of nuance to add to that.
One young person once asked me, challenged me to say if sharing stories across different areas was emotional porn. And I was like, oh, no, that's horrible. But I thought about it and I was like, if there's no space for active engagement and genuine concern and interest, and it's just to evoke emotion, then what is it for? And is it respectful? And if the answer is no, then I shouldn't do it. Yeah, it was very confronting. And I thought, you know what, actually, we need to have some of those harder conversations sometimes about what is the appropriate use of stories when they are very personal and they belong to somebody. We should treat them with respect and make sure that they have the space, that they have the respect that they need. But yeah, you're right. We also have another question. Moving on from that, that's very serious. Talking about lived experience researchers and I suppose where they're thriving and where systems are preventing them from thriving.
Oh gosh, that's a really great question. So I think what Wellcome funders provide. So I think some of the things we hear are making sure that those roles are properly resourced. I think there's something about funders setting the expectation that we see lived experience research, lived experience experts, so therefore lived experience researchers as a really vital part of research teams. I think some of the challenges are that this is still very new. There are lots of lived experience researchers been around for decades, but it's not common practice for lived experience researchers to be involved in the vast breadth of lived experience research. And so I think a lot of those researchers are all sort of figuring it out all those research teams are all figuring it out for the first time. So I think we can develop resources, guidance, professional networks of researchers with lived experience to really help bring people together to sort of make that change, to really document practice and understand what works and what doesn't in those spaces, I think is really critical. And I think we have a real responsibility as organisations like Wellcome to help make that change, both within the projects we fund, but also in the wider ecosystem, and to really see that lived experience research is a kind of critical part of mental health research, I think. So we're funding a range of projects at the moment to looking at lived experience leadership. So we're funding a number of lived experience leadership programs, some for sort of people in sort of dedicated lived experience roles. But one of the projects we're funding is also looking at a network for researchers who also have lived experience to understand what an inclusive research environment looks like for them. So some of this work is kind of we're sort of starting to try and fund some of that, because you're right, it's there are there's so much sort of misunderstanding / stigma, I think, about some of those roles that still exist.
And I suppose last question, because I could talk to you forever and I just looked at the time. Classic. Is so the takeaway for you as far as the last 6 to 8 years, I suppose did you say 6 years you've been in the role? Your favorite memory as far as a success of going, wow, I think we've really moved the dial on how lived experience is within the Wellcome Trust, and I'm proud of the work that I'm doing here?
Oh God, that's such a tough question. I think so. I suppose there's two things. One is there's an internal and an external one, I suppose. The internal one is, and now I hear, so we set it up in a way, so we have the embedded colleagues across all our mental health teams. We set it up in a way that the lived experience involvement doesn't rest on me and my team, that we try and support it and drive it, but we don't do all of it. And every other colleague in the mental health program is responsible for doing it. And now what the best thing about my job is there's so much stuff that goes on around lived experience I have no idea about, because everyone's just doing it. And it's like, that to me is magic. Like, it doesn't now rest on my team driving it. We just get told about some of the stuff that's happening and we're like, great, didn't have a clue that was going on. Wonderful. Because that shows that other people have now really starting to think this is a core part of their role. So that's one bit. The second thing, I suppose, the biggest win, a great thing I've heard, is when we fund a new research funding program, we'll bring all those teams together, usually at Wellcome. And so often I hear researchers come to me and will say, I've lived with mental health challenges for years. I've worked in this mental health research team for years. I never felt able to be open about my own lived experience. But organisations like Wellcome and others talking about lived experience as expertise meant I felt able to be open with my colleagues. And so that it's like the secondary change, I think, is we can't underestimate, of like the secondary benefit or influence, I suppose, that when organisations like Wellcome set lived experience as an expectation, the sort of secondary effects of that, I think, are always really exciting to see. So
It's beautiful. It's epic. Your impact, Kate, and your team, and just showing us what is possible reaches far beyond what you can see. And I'm just so grateful for you and your team, and your colleagues, and how they work, and the fact that the Wellcome Trust put the space within itself and challenged itself in ways that other people just haven't. You really are, for me, an example. I point people to you all the time and say, look, if they can do it, we can do it. It's hard, but it can be done, and you just have to start. And you definitely taught me that. And I thought I might just share where I got to with this ending of my. Can you see the screen again? Yeah. Yeah, at the end of the Churchill, and the conversations with Kate was one of those ones. And I think with the spotlight, I was thinking about now the things that I've learned from all the people. And, there is no one right way to make the cake that I thought I was going to get back. But as you've heard from Kate today and the other spotlight series, I think there are some things that I would definitely bake in my next cake if I was working with young people, and particularly with lived experience, about what needs to be in there. And although fun has not gone, because I love working with young people, they will always challenge and bring the excitement and the fun. There's always an opportunity. Even budgets can be fun, people. Even budgets and policy can be fun. But there are some things that you have that I was really inspired to bring to my next projects. And I was thinking about, for those of you who are on the call and listening at home, as they say, is like, I think about this all the time, is that what can I shift in my work, in my leadership, in my organization, to make sure that young people, and particularly for me, I care about like the young people with lived experience, and not just being heard, but deriving the decisions that shape the future, and not just their futures, like our futures. That expertise is so important in good decision making. So I'll leave you with that and just say thank you so much. I just want to thank AAC for your leadership in this space, and the opportunity to have these conversations with the youth sector and young people and our allies across the space. I so appreciate the advocacy that AAC does. You have consistently stepped in and stepped up for young people when no one else was. And so I'm so grateful, Dean, and I'll encourage everybody to follow all AAC's channels and sign up, become a member. It's very important in Australia right now to really get behind our peak. So thank you, Dean. Thank you for this opportunity. Handing back to you.
And Katie, I just wanted to thank you very much, and Kate, for your wonderful contributions tonight. It's been such a wonderful experience for us to have you over the last 5 events. And just before I close the event, I just want to post a little reminder. I'm sure everybody who is associated with the AIC will be sick of me pestering them with message. But we do have 2 events on Thursday. One of them will be a national roundtable on young people and workplace rights, and we have a few very good speakers for that. We will also have a drop-in consultation with the federal government's Office for Youth, where you guys will get sort of feedback on how they're developing their engagement strategy. And also, next Tuesday, my campaign group will be leading their event on Swipe Right on Respect, which is about, digital relationships online. So please do share that with the young people in your network. It's been a very busy time, and I'm sure by the end of next week, I will need a long rest. But thank you so much for all your help and support. And hopefully we'll see you at the upcoming events. All the best, team. Thank you very much.
Thanks.
Thanks, everyone.
See you later.